The question in South Africa of who is actually infected with HIV, age, gender, or race, is extremely difficult to comment on with any kind of reliability. The reason being that most of the HIV tests, such as they are, that are done in South Africa, are done almost, not exclusively, but largely at antenatal clinics, which are public clinics attended primarily by pregnant African women. So we know a lot about generalizations about HIV rates as they're found among pregnant African women. As for the rest of the population, to the best of my knowledge, very little has ever been done to try and track the frequency of HIV prevalence among, say, the white community or the Asian community or the mixed race community, the so-called Cape Coloreds in South Africa.
And why is ELISA testing, single ELISA testing on pregnant women in Africa, not a valid way for formulating statistics for the entire continent?
Because pregnant women are not the same as unpregnant women or the same as men in general, in that the medical literature has abundant examples showing that when you give an HIV test to a pregnant woman, the chances of it coming back as a false positive are so high as to render the test all but invalid. Maybe it's 30 or 40% would come back false positive because of the hormonal changes and immunological changes that are taking place in a woman's body as a result of pregnancy can trigger just that false positive result on an ELISA test.
And what is a verbal autopsy?
A verbal autopsy is a term used widely in Africa and accepted widely in Africa. It means that an individual has died, and because no one is really sure what the cause of death is, because very often a doctor is not in attendance, because a death certificate is not issued, and because an actual physical autopsy is very rarely performed, an enumerator or a person keeping track of deaths may go to a village or go to a family and say, we understand that your relative, Nsimbi, recently died. And the members of the family will give a verbal report. They'll say, yes, Nsimbi was sick with this or he was sick with that, and eventually he died. And they'll say, well, what was his condition like when he died in terms of malnourished, in terms of fever, in terms of temperature, in terms of any kind of lesions on his body, anything of that sort. The members of the family will then share that information with whoever is asking them the questions. And that then becomes a verbal autopsy in which the spoken word of people who were around someone who died is taken as the evidence for the cause of death. Now, what that means, of course, is that this can be extremely general, very unreliable, and there's no way of checking or validating the accuracy of what one person says was the so-called cause of death of another person. I would define AIDS, again, according to the definition used by the World Health Organization, which makes a distinction about the definition of AIDS in Africa versus the definition of AIDS in North America, for example. In Africa, AIDS is said to be a condition which is demonstrated by 4 clinical symptoms: a persistent cough, a high fever, loose stools or diarrhea for 14 days, and a 10% loss of body weight over a 2-month period. If an African presents those clinical symptoms at a clinic, that person is said to have AIDS. That's not the definition of AIDS used in the United States. My dispute is with whether that's a new disease that I just described, or whether or not those are very widespread and very common symptoms of poverty, which have been given a new name by Western researchers in the 1980s.
Approximately how many Africans live in poverty today?
It's going to vary from country to country. Remember, Africa is a continent of 650 million people in 55 different countries. The definition of poverty itself is going to vary from country to country. But I would say that certainly 85% of the people that live on the African continent today probably get by on less than $1 or $2 a day. And by that definition, I'd say 85% of the people in Africa could be qualified as being impoverished. The clinical symptoms that define an AIDS case are, as I've said before, this persistent fever and a cough and diarrhea and weight loss. Those are symptoms that are associated with a wide array of living conditions, with poverty and certain other diseases. Those are symptoms that you would find widely present among people that suffer from malaria or from tuberculosis. You would certainly see all or most of those symptoms among someone who was severely malnourished. Someone who suffered from an upper respiratory illness would manifest those same symptoms. They are the symptoms that you see in a person who is not in good health. Those are serious conditions, those 4 clinical symptoms. And I think that, as many have observed, poverty is the world's deadliest disease. And you are going to find those kinds of symptoms generally among people who are malnourished, who have diseases that go untreated, who are not having access to clean drinking water, hence suffer from a wide variety of waterborne illnesses or parasitic infections, and also people who live in conditions where there is poor sanitation. As a result of poor sanitation and improper getting rid of waste, those are breeding grounds for the kinds of diseases that I've just described, and for which, in fact, you will find widespread evidence across Africa.
Is there an HIV epidemic in Africa right now?
That's a very tricky question to answer. Is there an HIV epidemic in Africa? Because generally the international conferences talk about an AIDS epidemic in Africa. And if you asked me, is there an AIDS epidemic in Africa based on the definition of AIDS, and you said, is there an epidemic of persistent cough, high fever, diarrhea, and weight loss in Africa, I'd say, oh, there's an epidemic of that, all right. And it's been accelerating in the last 20 years.
But do you believe there's an epidemic caused by a retrovirus called HIV?
I don't believe that there is evidence that I've ever seen that would show me that those symptoms that I've just described that define AIDS in Africa can be possibly linked to HIV, because by conservative estimates, 95 to 97% of the people who are said to have those symptoms of AIDS have never been tested for anything. Well, the question here is the context of the political economy, or of public debt, or of refinancing loans on the part of some of these countries in Africa at the insistence of the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. Now, it's very interesting that over the past 20 years or so, certainly since 1980 or 79, which corresponds nicely with the years of alleged AIDS in Africa, that the World Bank has instituted a series of policies which are known as structural adjustment programs, or SAP is another term used for them. And the thinking behind structural adjustment was basically that African countries in the 1960s and the 1970s, in the decades after independence, were in fact spending too much money on social services, on education, on public health, and not in fact trying to get individual users of education or of public health clinics or of medicines to foot the bill themselves. And so the key behind structural adjustment was as follows, that a given country in Africa, say Mozambique, or Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Congo, any of those countries, in order to continue qualifying for the loans from the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, had to take very clear and decisive steps to bring about a structural readjustment of their priorities, which meant, for instance, that primary and secondary education or public health in rural areas would in fact be handled more on a fee payer basis on the part of students or parents or people that attended the clinic, rather than the state directing money at those services. It was a way of saying that in order to qualify for loans, different priorities had to be used in terms of public spending, and the biggest ones to suffer cuts were education and public health. The structural adjustment programs, I think, were seen as a kind of short-term corrective to what had been massive amounts of debt that African states had run up in the decades of the 60s and 70s. And by the early 1980s, there was a very conservative administration in Washington under Ronald Reagan, and a number of technocrats working at the World Bank who really argued this case very strongly. It was really kind of a new austerity and a belt tightening for African countries, and it was received very well by the Reagan administration. Well, I think what I would say is that the brain drain of medical personnel and of highly educated people from Africa, the persistent conditions of poverty and of inadequate food resources and a lack of medical care, a lack of cheap medicines, for example, to treat malaria, tuberculosis, tetanus, measles, cholera, things like that. Those directly would contribute to the presentation of the symptoms, which are so widespread in Africa and are said to be called AIDS. And so the context in which these symptoms appear is crucial, but it's been largely overlooked by the medical profession and by the natural sciences. As a social scientist, as a historian, as an economic historian, I feel very strongly that if we want to understand why more Africans were getting sick in the 80s and the 90s, we have to look at the historical moment in which those things were occurring. And that's a social science explanation, not a biological sciences one involving a retrovirus or behavior changes, as has been alleged by most of the orthodox AIDS experts. One of the more unfortunate, if not outright misleading aspects of the focus on AIDS is that rather than looking at questions of structural adjustment, national indebtedness, the brain drain, or the way in which African countries are inserted into the global economy, instead of doing that, the emphasis has been on shifting the attention to Africans' personal or individual behavior. Now, to that extent, the notion of sexuality or behavior modification, changes when it comes to sexuality, is a very clever but extremely short-sighted and erroneous way of attempting to eradicate poverty. What it basically says is that Africans are the ones responsible for their own poverty. Those conditions that define impoverished living are caused by reckless sexual behavior on the part of Africans. That takes us back to the 19th century. That's exactly what Victorian missionaries and early European colonial officials believed. And so there's something very familiar to me, which I would criticize now as I would criticize historically, that assumes that there's something about Africans' behavior which is the cause of poverty. And when you link sex and black people, as many AIDS researchers do, then you're face to face with a very standard kind of racist interpretation of black people and sex, which I strongly repudiate. Is there a difference between sex as it's practiced in North America and sex as it's practiced in Africa? As far as I can tell, none whatsoever, none at all. I would, however, say that generally people in, say, the state of California or in big cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles, or even my city here, which is a university town, Chico, my experience has been that Western European people and North Americans tend to be far more experimental and far more engaged in a wide range of sexual partners, most people being heterosexual, in fact, on both of those continents, Africa and North America. And so one of the conclusions that I think I've come to very early on is that if you want to look at what causes AIDS in North America or California, or what causes AIDS in South Africa, sex is the last place to be looking for it. There are other kinds of non-sexual insults, such as drug use or poverty, that clearly are better explanations for why certain people get sick. It's not their sexual promiscuity, it's either their drug use or untreated other kinds of conditions or the larger conditions of poverty from which those symptoms are so clearly a reflection, certainly in Africa. Much of the discussion about AIDS in Africa seems to be driven by numbers. It's driven by statistics. The more dramatic the numbers, the more catchy the story. And I've noticed this for the last 4 or 5 years. And I think the 3 questions that we have to ask when we see statistics about AIDS cases or AIDS deaths or AIDS orphans in Africa are the fundamental questions we ask of any number. Number 1, who created this statistic? Number 2, how was this statistic created? And number 3, for what purpose was it created? Now, generally, the media doesn't ask any of those questions. They simply accept the numbers that they were given. However, my work in South Africa, as a member of President Thabo Mbeki's AIDS advisory panel, led me to look extremely closely at figures in South Africa about AIDS cases or AIDS deaths. And when doing that, I realized that those numbers could not, under any circumstances, stand close scrutiny, because the basis upon which they were gathered was as weak and as feeble and as unreliable as any numbers I'd ever seen anywhere. And this was one of the big issues that divided us on the AIDS advisory panel. The whole question of AIDS orphans, the question of the definition of an orphan, and the question of the counting of orphans takes us right back to my main criticisms about what is so flawed and misleading and downright erroneous about so much about what we're counting when we count AIDS in Africa. An orphan in Western cultures is defined as someone who has lost both of his parents. Father and mother are dead. That person is an orphan. In Africa, there's a very different definition of an orphan, which is often used by the people who keep records about AIDS orphans. An orphan in Zimbabwe, for example, is officially a child who has lost one or both of his parents. That's an orphan in Zimbabwe. In Malawi, an orphan is someone who has lost one or both of his parents from an orphan in Malawi is a person who has lost one or both of his parents to death, or has one or both of his parents suffering from a terminal illness. So we have to understand that the definition of an orphan in Africa is decisively and glaringly different than an orphan in the West. The other thing to keep in mind is that, without sounding too cynical about this, I've often wondered, and I've asked this at the AIDS conference, if a child walking on the village path with a runny nose and no adult supervision is assumed to be an orphan by the people that are doing the counting. Now, that's a harsh way of saying that the people who are behind these AIDS orphans numbers are running together loose definitions of what's an orphan, and they certainly are not examining closely whether or not that child has lost one or both of his parents to begin with. So I would simply say those numbers, like so many of the other numbers associated with AIDS, must absolutely be scrutinized, looked at very carefully and closely in terms of what we're counting and how do we know these things. And those are not answers that you will get from anyone in the White House. And I would suggest you focus, for example, on any particular country you have in mind, Kenya, South Africa, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and ask for very accurate bases for those numbers.
Have you ever asked for those numbers?
I've asked for those numbers in South Africa, and they are unavailable. And South Africa is the country with the best record-keeping epidemiology, mortality and morbidity, what people die of and what illnesses they suffer. South Africa has the best numbers of any country on the African continent, bar none. Well, I think when looking at any of the statistics about AIDS or death from AIDS in Africa, I think we all must keep in mind that Africa as a continent has the lowest percentage of official vital statistics in terms of deaths, and that's about 1%. In other words, we only know the cause of death for about 1% of all the people who die in Africa in any given year. And so when you read statistics about AIDS cases or AIDS deaths or AIDS orphans, always keep that in mind and simply ask, how do they know that? What is that number based on? The weekly epidemiological record is an official tabulation by the World Health Organization in Geneva, which tabulates the number of AIDS cases reported in each member country per year. And they've been keeping these records since about 1982. The report is updated every November. The latest numbers that we have are from the weekly epidemiological record of November of 2000. This is a report which is updated from member states of the World Health Organization every year. The numbers that are listed officially in the weekly epidemiological record stand in stark, amazing contrast to the numbers that the media picks up. What one is struck by is that the total number of AIDS cases reported in Africa officially, according to the WHO, over a 20-year period is something like about 800,000. That's approximately 40,000 cases of AIDS on a continent of 650 million people. Now, having said that, these numbers are what we need to look at officially. If someone has better numbers than that, then they should be encouraged to put them on the table. Thus far, they have not. What you have are estimates, extrapolations, and projections, not actual numbers itself. These are the best numbers we have. One of the things we hear constantly in the news is how HIV is the leading cause of death or a top cause of death among young Americans. Once again, these claims have to be verified against the actual official causes of death numbers issued by the Centers for Disease Control in their National Vital Statistics report. The one I have is for 1998. That report was issued in July of 2000. It's the latest one we have. It's important to note, for example, that the total number of people in the United States who are aged 15 to 24 is 37 million. There's 37 million Americans 15 to 24. The total number of people in that age category who were said to have died from HIV in 1998 is 194. 194 out of 37 million. The next age category is 25 to 44. There are 83 million Americans aged 25 to 44. The total number who was said to have died from HIV in 1998 is 8,600. Okay? So we're looking at extremely healthy cohorts of individuals with very low death rates. And I think in both of those cases, 15 to 24-year-olds or 25 to 44-year-olds, we can be pretty certain exactly what those people were suffering from and how they were being treated. And when you look at those kind of numbers, the so-called AIDS epidemic vanishes. And the numbers are there. There isn't any magical reasoning or unique research that one has to do. You just have to look them up.